So hi, everyone. Welcome to Workforce Data Science in the US federal government. My name's Aubrey Scarborough, and I'm with the Federal Aviation Administration, and I'm also Human Resources Lead Data Scientist. For the past couple years, I've been chairing an internal data work group in HR, and we're trying to solidify data's governance strategy, and also manage our HR systems as well as data sources. So this, of course, gives us the tools for more in-depth workforce analytics and the type of speedy reporting that people generally don't assume HR can handle. And I'm also trying to gather the wider FAA community as well into involving them into using all of my awesome dashboards. So are there any other HR or actually FAA folks here? Yeah, cool. Okay, like two. I'm glad you guys could join. So we've done the intro. Next, I'm going to give you some background on the project. And then we're going to jump right into dashboard functionality. I'm going to be demoing it for you. Then we're going to be going over future steps and leaving the questions to the end. So the project. The goal of the project was to quickly analyze data gathered on the federal workforce and then visualize the results, placing them into understandable reports for our leadership. We need to make sure that they have accurate, relevant data, especially when they're making policy decisions, going to Capitol Hill, trying to defend our air traffic controllers. There's a lot going on here. So this is a very big deal, of course, for two major reasons. One in particular is the upcoming drain in baby boomer retirements. This is going to affect everybody. And another one is also the numerous pressing initiatives to make the government a more efficient place. Everybody wants that as well. These are, of course, in addition to lesser known issues, but equally important, such as even being able to identify all of your data sources, something I work on intimately all the time. It's harder than it seems like it should be. So I wanted to ask you a few questions. Has anybody heard of FedScope? Great. Okay, what about the Federal Viewpoint Survey, yeah? Awesome, even more. That one's a little bit more famous or infamous, depending on how you think of it. So I'll give you a bit of a background on FedScope. This is the quarterly snapshot in time of the US government's workforce. It captures demographics of active employees. And then there's also two other sections to it, the new hires report and the separations report. Those two come out annually. Next, going over that viewpoint survey. This is an annual survey that's sent out to the federal workforce that gathers responses on employee engagement, which is a bit of a mix between productiveness and satisfaction in their positions with their supervisors. We're going to go over this, believe me. It also gathers a large amount of demographic data on the employees as well, kind of similar to the FedScope info. And it also captures participation in employee benefits programs, which is something that's very important to us. So does anybody use data from here or like this? Yeah, I'm seeing a few nods. That's good, cool. If you're not, it might apply to you in surprising ways. But if you are, I'm hoping you certainly get something out of this presentation. So you've probably asked questions similar to ones that I have if you do use this data. Does high engagement actually contribute to employee retention? It's a tough one. What actions can an agency take to keep those high-performing employees? How do we make our succession planning efforts actually work, considering those waves of retirements coming? So these questions can definitely be overwhelming for many HR offices, but with the right tools and teams, they don't have to be. So let's jump into this dashboard. I'm going to do some awesome movement here. So, when in the actual dashboard, you get an intro page. I totally went over this. There's not much different here, except I will point out that generally when I do create new dashboards for people, I at least try to give them some background as to what it has, what questions it answers. Maybe that's in an email, maybe it's in an actual intro page in the workbook, but we can figure that out. So let's actually go over the first slide. This is the FedScope overview, right? It's going over our workforce, and we're using that FedScope data. It includes active employees, separation count, retention rate, age groups, gender, federal tenure, STEM positions, an area chart that shows the separation trends over age groups, right? So this particular project is a retention project. So that's why you're gonna see the separation count as opposed to some of that new hire information that I mentioned that FedScope also includes. I needed to stay in scope for this project. Scope creep is a huge issue. So let's go ahead and check out just the female population. I'm gonna show you a few things here. So first, just looking at the age groups, I'm a little concerned. We see that 40s and older accounts for nearly 75% of our population, our female population. This is illustrating the dire need for succession planning and training employees for the future in management positions that they might hold, right? So next is not quite as, that's here, by the way. It's weird using a laser pointer here. So next you might also see here in this area, it's not quite as dramatic, but we do see an increase of women who quit or transfer out of the agency in their 30s. That probably has something to do with family planning. You might want to look into that as well. We also see that only 25%, actually technically 24.1% of women are in STEM positions. So this is a particularly interesting point for me as a woman. I also have an engineering degree and a science degree. I'm not designated in a STEM position, even though I use math on a daily basis at work. Being in HR in particular, this raises flags for me about the mismatch between position descriptions and the work that's actually being done. And I see this all over the place. You do want to look, and actually, if any of you have looked into federal job postings recently, you might know that the position descriptions aren't super helpful in some situations. That leads to problems once somebody is hired, and you have to write performance plans off of those position descriptions as well. So if you're looking and knowing that your particular department has a lot of STEM people, but it's not showing up as a lot of STEM people, again, something you might want to look into. So let's move over to the FedView survey. This is the overview of Federal Employee Engagement Survey, those FedView survey responses. And we start with a breakdown of employees. Here in particular, we're looking at those employees that are planning to stay versus planning to leave. If you're familiar with this data, you might be particularly familiar with this particular question. I'll let you know now that previous studies have found little to no correlation between people saying that they're going to leave and people who actually end up leaving. So, it might not actually apply, and you might not be finding statistical significance in that answer, but this is still really excellent information to go over. You're still going to get the feel for how people are, happy or not with their jobs. So this also includes responses by demographic, right? Again, we're looking over age groups, federal tenure, the pie charts on the side, gender, minority, disability. It gives us a real look as to who responded to the survey. So the overview can be helpful, but here's especially where some people need to dig deeper. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the veteran and military workforce. If we look specifically at our active military and veterans, we can pinpoint some areas of interest. Here we see vets say that they're planning to leave here, right? But they're showing pretty low scores when it comes to how they feel about their leadership. That's not so great. Overall, they're pretty happy when it comes to their direct supervisors, as well as their actual work experience. But especially when we get into those people who say they want to leave, we're seeing the lower leadership scores. We are probably going to want to ask employees about this, address any concerns that they might have, so we're not losing good people. The majority might also be looking for some help with education. We see that most of them have a bachelor's degree or less. So this also opens up another discussion about internal training and educational benefits. Do we have these programs? Are they robust enough? Are they offering the types of courses that people are looking for? We'll probably want to look into communication about these programs if we have them, making sure that we're targeting, our vets, our military folks. This is a way to identify the fact that they might be interested in this information. We want to make sure that people are aware of their educational opportunities. So looking more into the FedView survey, because there's a lot of information in there, we can focus on the workforce that participates in employee benefits programs. So here we have a selection of those: alternate work schedules, otherwise known as like telework, right? EAP is Employee Assistance Program, and of course we have elder care and child care. This one might seem a bit obvious, but for those folks who know about the programs and aren't allowed to use them, those orange lines, their engagement scores are not looking so great. Not surprising. So just like updating those position descriptions, many work duties might also need to be updated, right? There's new technology out there. There's new options for people who want to work from home. We might be able to deem more positions as telework ready, or work with them in other ways, using things like rotating days off. It definitely helps with that work-life balance that so many people are looking for, and increasing those engagement scores. We also probably need to discuss alternative options for childcare and elder care, especially if you don't have access to a childcare facility in your department. Those two programs in particular, they relieve a huge amount of stress on employees. Not surprising. So any discussion that you can have about that would probably be helpful. So now that we have a better understanding of those two data sets, especially looking at all of those breakdowns and overviews and exploring them a bit, we can actually start comparing the two data sets together. So remember I mentioned that the planning to leave question in the survey is not a good indication of retention just by itself. That statistical significance is not there. So being able to combine the two data sets with actual survey results and actual retention rates, that's what we're doing here. So first, we start with a comparison of the engagement scores and the retention rates and the discrepancy between the two. So this shows us the agencies with the largest discrepancy and down to the smallest discrepancies. So this can definitely act as a guide for agencies looking into this data. And maybe you want to chat to the National Credit Union here. Check them out. They only have a 0.6% discrepancy between the two of these. So you might want to chat with them and figure out what they're doing to help keep these engaged employees. I'm really curious to chat with them themselves, or myself. So then back to the comparison. But before we go any further, I do want to give a little bit background on the FedScope, and I mean the FedView survey as well. So the survey itself ends up having 9 categories of questions. There's about 84 questions that you answer. Only about 23 of them actually matter. I'm not going to tell you which ones. You have to go read the reports. So the Office of Personnel Management, OPM, they run these surveys. And they create a couple of reports each year that go over the results. They almost always find that there are 5 categories that have significant results. They refer to these as the key drivers. And so in addition to this performance feedback right here, we're going to go even deeper. We have cooperative management scores, merit system principles, employee training, and work-life balance. Work-life balance is an important one. So these are the next 4 key drivers. So those 5 together are typically known as the 5 key drivers. The remaining ones you'll see in a second. So OPM has done their own research and deemed these significant for the most part. So as we're looking at these charts, we see that as the engagement scores are increasing with the responses. So where people are saying that they strongly disagree with a number of things, their engagement scores are much lower, whereas they grow as people tend to strongly agree with things. It makes sense, but it's nice to see it laid out like this. Another thing to note here is that for the most part, retention is staying in a little bit of a curve where you're still finding good people are leaving, and we want to address that. So this is where we addressed it. All of these notes on the side. You saw previously, too, this also had notes, except down on the bottom. I changed it up for this one. So this is where a lot of the research went into the project. There's a lot of information here, right? As you're looking at the charts, right? You need to note these sections next to it. And you're looking at what will keep engaged employees and how you can engage the unproductive employees. So checking out those notes is definitely helpful. So as we move on to the next page, we're going to see those remaining 4. The job resources, supportive coworkers, performance recognition scores, and performance rating. The performance rating one, I always thought that was kind of interesting. That it ends up being the least significant when so much importance is placed on it. It's kind of weird considering how much of a push so many agencies and departments are giving to the performance ratings. And we're really not seeing that they matter too much, except for in certain situations. So even though this section might not be significant as a whole for most of the departments, it's still good information to have. And the suggestions are still totally relevant. So I'd also like to note here that you're seeing these familiar filters on the side. These have been on most of my pages. In order to combine these data sets, I created cohorts based on employee demographics, these filters. I kind of use that as like a primary key to combine the 2 data sets together. So that is how I did my cohort analysis. So the cohorts are fairly simple for a reason. I wanted to make sure that people would be able to repeat this process, pick the same type of demographic information in your own data sets, and kind of use that same marriage of the 2. It's usually easily applicable to any other data sets that you have about personnel. So then we get into the fun stuff. I think it's fun. After that full cohort analysis, I played around with some statistics. So for example, here's a couple Kaplan Meier survival analysis curves. It's used here to predict the length of service of employees. So overall prediction and prediction by occupational category down at the bottom. So I'm also gonna filter it by ladies here. Kind of increases. So the top graph might be of interest to managers and directors. helping them plan what their workforce might look like in a few years. So in 10 years here, an employee has 45% probability of separating in about 10 years. You might want to apply that to your teams. You might be losing close to half of your team in 10 years. So what are you going to do about your new hires? How are you going to plan for that? And the bottom one might be more of an interest to me. I like placing myself into these charts and seeing kind of what happens. So I separated it here by occupational category. So I can see there's actually really no difference between technical and professional. So maybe I don't need to deal with that position description issue I mentioned. But, according to my curve, I have a 45% probability of separating in 7.84 years, however long that is. I don't know if I'm going to follow it, but who knows? Then we're going to look a little bit into the correlation matrices. These in particular are sub-index correlation matrices from the past few years. It includes retention rates and the engagement score as well, so you can make those direct comparisons. If you remember what the sub-index is, let's go back to my VETS example. They were pretty happy with their direct supervisors. They were happy with their work experience, not so happy with their leadership. Might want to look into that. So they're shown here as government-wide. So these numbers don't look so great. I bet a few of you are going to ask that question. As you break it down by department to department, the numbers do change, and you're seeing very different correlations. But we're not going to do that here. Be happy to share my code, though. And this next one is just looking at the same stuff, but for those top 5 key drivers. Again, if you want to look into some of the less significant drivers, they might be significant for your agency or department. So it's definitely a thing that you might want to look into, seeing what actually matters most for your group. And then the most important slide ever, references. Suggested reading material. This includes a lot of those reports and everything that I use to fill out the suggestions, and obviously looking at what OPM wrote as well. So let me get back to my slides. You guys get to see all my giant notes. So now that you've seen the end result, you totally want to make one of your own, right? Yeah, totally. Look at all those nods. That's great. So let me walk you through the process of actually making it. So it started with OPM, the Office of Personnel Management. They're the ones who gather this data. They manage the entire employee survey process, sending out all the links to federal employees, desperately hoping that we respond. How many responded? Anybody take this? Yeah. I'm sure they appreciate it. I took it the first time this year. I was so excited, obviously. So they do something slightly similar for that FedScope data. However, that time they send it out to HR departments as requests, but we're mandated to respond, so that response rate is obviously higher. And it takes some time to anonymize the data, so somewhere between a quarter or 3 later, we get a couple of PDF reports like you just saw. Those are good reports. And also access to the actual data sources and a number of infographics and all sorts of stuff explaining the data itself. So this is where the amazing GSA teams come in. GSA is the General Services Administration, for those of you who don't know. They're basically our landlord, federal government's landlord. They're cool. So they have their HR innovation and integration team, which I'm super jealous of. They worked closely with their human capital analytics team, which I'm also way jealous of. They gathered this OPM data, the data sources, and placed them into an AWS data mart. They actually also started integrating their own data into it, which is really cool. Then I came into the picture. So in the spirit of departmental collaboration and taking advantage of finishing my grad school thesis, I began working with the GSA teams to address the goal of this project. Do you folks remember what the goal of this project was? No, maybe not. Here, say it with me. To quickly analyze the federal workforce data so leadership can use it. It's easy. That's the Cliff Notes version, of course. So what you didn't see in most of my pretty charts, some of my pretty charts, was all that math. I used a mix of SQL, R, and Tableau itself, ran some confirmatory factor analysis on all of those responses, various bits of the data, ordinal, multinomial, binary logistic regressions, of course that cohort analysis, the matrices, the Kaplan Meier curve, all sorts of other stuff. So what now? What do I do with it? I'm here, so that's cool. It got me here. That's pretty awesome. So I'm sharing the results, right? So how many people had to deal with the hiring freeze or any hiring freeze? It was tough. And has anybody heard of or read OMB Memo 1722? Yeah, that's a tough one too, for those who don't know code name of OMB memos, because why would you? It's basically the government's hiring, ooh, I did it again. The government's hiring and workforce efficiency reform memo. It was a big one. So this whole project ties into the major conversation being held and freaked out over by many government HR offices, and I wouldn't be surprised if, private sector might have some issues with this as well. But it's a very timely project. And after the FAA and GSA collaboration, it was immediately presented, of course, to University of Maryland, because I needed to graduate. And the US Data Cabinet, which is a great group. Please join them if you can. And also at the OPM Research Summit. I think they were kind of bizarrely intrigued at what I did with their data. So I ended up giving out basically all of my data, all of my business cards. I gave demonstrations and follow-up meetings to NASA, NIH, Education, CDC, all sorts of these folks. IRS was cool. I even had a great conversation, actually, with the CDC about that survivability curve. They should know a thing or two about survivability curves. They use them a lot. So they were actually working on a really cool application of it as well, where they were taking employee retention with regards to having them recently, like an employee recently received a promotion or maybe a bad performance score, and seeing what the effect of that on the employee was. It was really awesome. So I've frankly been totally overwhelmed with the response and the number of people who have been doing these awesome workforce analytics and what they've been doing with it. So remember, this was all just done with the public data sets. Can you imagine if you're just using your own internal data at the agency level, at the organizational level, at the team level? There's a lot of insights that can happen there. So by integrating HR systems, performance data, you could do workload schedules, hiring, that's a big one, more. You'd be able to narrow in on your own organization's strengths and weaknesses, really intelligently aiming your efforts towards policy reviews and that actual reforming of the federal workforce that we're all trying to strive towards. So what now for me in particular? I'm applying it to the FAA. That's exactly what I've been doing, even as I was building this additional dashboard. So it's very important to note that this involves culture change, which is very challenging. And I actually came to the conference last year, and that was one of my main focuses when I was picking which little sessions I wanted to go to. There's a lot of information, and there's a lot of people who can help you here with that. So for me, it took a while for my dashboards to get in front of leadership. Maybe I was one of those leadership could use a little effort. But now when they see the flexibility of the tools, they are constantly asking for more. And it's really kind of amazing with who they're getting presented to, when they're getting presented, and how much they're actually being used. So we're making progress from just reporting numbers to actually providing more of that business intelligence. And business intelligence is one of those terms that I love because it's thrown all over the place, and it is usually meaningless. Most of the time, it's just repeating numbers. But with these tools and implementing them at these levels, you can actually get business intelligence for what it's actually defined as. So here are some examples of what I call the human capital snapshot. You're only seeing bits and pieces of it. We're giving lines of business in the FAA, our different FAA organizations, the ability to really take an overview and look at their own workforce. We're giving them gains and loss information, workforce trends, trends in their different benefits usage, hiring. So we're still working through a lot of the implementation of the presentation that you actually just saw. We're still working on different data source connections and really grabbing those pieces of data and presenting them in, FAA ways. We like doing things our own way. So we're still working through that implementation, but it is getting there, and it is being used. Even though in many areas we still need to gain the trust of other teams, break down those data silos, win over some data hoarders. But it's happening, and it's pretty awesome. So that's the end of the presentation. But I hope that I was able to accomplish a couple things, so I have a couple new goals. One is for all the taxpayers here. I hope you have a better understanding of the work that we're doing as civil servants to really make the government more efficient. We're really trying. And one is also for the other feds in similar positions as me, or even private sector, whatever. If you saw something here today that you think you can use, I would love to talk to you. I really desperately want more of this out there, and chatting with everybody is a great way to do that. And I would also love to hear about any solutions that you guys have. So I will give you my info and then also open the floor for questions. Yes? So for this particular one, right, you saw that I had that intro slide and then also like the references. It's kind of meant to be used as its own like standalone report. We can sort by department and give them like the PDF versions and stuff, but eventually what we're trying to do is get it on the opmmax.gov site so people can use it and kind of download and cannibalize whatever visuals that they want. So it's kind of all in process here. But if you want it, I can give it to you. It's all open data, who cares? Isn't that the point? So that's kind of a tough thing. In being in the FAA and not actually part of GSA, I had to use a standalone version of their AWS server to get the data. So what you're actually looking at here is just a extract database. I'm not connected to anything at the moment, but you can be. It just has to be to their open one, which is a little less upkept. I had to do a lot of data cleaning for that. But again, like if it's something that more people want to get involved in and kind of help run it, and instead of just placing that extracted file on OMB Max, like there's definitely options here. Saw a few others, yes?
How well do you find leadership responding to and wanting to continue to look at your dashboards?
Actually, really well. Once they realize, so in the FAA, right, for many of the reports that we were giving, they were only getting them quarterly, sometimes annually, just not very often, and usually with out-of-date data by that point in time. So just for the fact that I could give them like 80% of something that they used to get, but monthly or per pay period blew their minds. They love that. Like, if there's any way that they can actually get timely data before they go on to whatever meeting that they need to, that's what they were looking for. So we do still give them PDF printouts. Some of them are pulling it up on their iPads, which is great, but it's still, like, that's the number one sell for it, that we've also built so many of these things, answering our own questions that we're getting all the time, right? So more often than not, if we get a request, all we have to do is dig up that link and send it to them. And they were expecting it to take a week or two. And to be able to provide that in such a ridiculously timely fashion, that is also the biggest sell. So once they really realized that flexibility alone, the sales pitch was a lot easier. Yes?
On your driver's dashboard, you got kind of all of those notes of the analysis that you've done. Were those dynamic notes, so that if somebody changed a feature, the notes changed, or are the notes?
That's interesting. So originally they were dynamic. Depending on what you were seeing in particular, I had different sections for whether or not 5 different sections from strongly disagree to strongly agree, right? We wanted to specifically capture those particular people, but that was found to be a little bit too confusing for the users. So I still have all that research, but we're not actually using it. So those particular sections are not dynamic, but it still has all of the same notes in it, just not specifically for the people in that particular agreement category. But I liked it that way, so I have a version of it that has it that way. And I actually want to apply that to performance ratings. I think that would be a really good way to use it, and especially if I can work with the CDC more and use that Kaplan Meier curve that they're using for the performance ratings as well. That could be really cool. Yeah. Yes? Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So I'm part of the business planning and performance group, and we are specifically the HR group that addresses our business plan goals. So all of the strategic initiatives, all of those, everything. We need to make sure that we're answering those particular percentages that we need to meet and goals met. So definitely. So internally, of course, that's where I would get that data. It's a little iffy when you're just using the public data sets. And you saw here that I only went up to 2015 because as I was building this, that's the latest year I had. So of course I wouldn't be able to use that to account for FY17 data. We'd have to use our internal data, but we absolutely are. Yeah. Sorry, I've been ignoring this side, I'm sorry. Is there anything over here? Yes?
When it comes to leadership, I know our company, a lot of times they get overwhelmed with the plethora of reports that they receive.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of the opposite of you guys' problem where they weren't getting reports, they're getting too many. So, and now there's a dashboard like Oprah, like you get a dashboard, you get a dashboard. So how would you address that, like, in the FAA, like, when they become overwhelmed with how many dashboards they're receiving and which ones they should focus on?
So yeah, I totally have that problem. One of the main problems, and actually I was in a thing this morning, I think it was like top 10 things to do as a sysadmin, and one of them was clean out all your clutter, and I really need to do that badly. I do have a number of people who are just looking at older versions of dashboards, and then they're like, why isn't this refreshed? I'm like, they're not looking at the right one. It's not as much as a problem as I would assume that it should be, because so many of the leadership and so many of the managers are still using the PDFs that I initially send out like at the beginning of the month. So it's something that I have to address, but I have notes on how to. But moving forward, we're actually going to be really taking a look at who's using which ones and which ones we need to combine as well. We've actually already started combining a number of specifically hiring dashboards, because we were finding that the person who's looking at the interview schedules Also needs to know any of the upcoming entry on duty and when new hires are going to be coming up. That makes sense, right? So they're looking for similar sections. So we're kind of making broader project files now to address particular concerns instead of the original format that we had of just breaking down the project files by our org codes and which org needs which project. So a lot of stuff. I hope that answered your question. Yes.
Were you also able to add dimensions like GS level, occupational, or occupation series?
That's totally an option. However, I found with this particular dashboard, the more details I went into, the longer it would take to just I need hyper. I need hyper so bad. Hyper will solve all of my problems. If I have hyper, I can add all of that in there.
Are those data sets available in FedScope?
Yes. There is so much data in FedScope. Oh my God. And so much data as well in the FedView surveys. It's fascinating, really, just going through some of that stuff. I would highly recommend just if those two sites, let me see if I can grab them real quick. Oh, that's not a mouse. These guys. Sorry. Animations. They're simple little URLs, but they have a lot of info in them. There's a lot to explore there. And you basically download these data cubes. Fortunately for me, I didn't really have to deal with them because GSA already dealt with them. But there's plenty of tools out there that you can explore. There's a lot of data. It's great. Yeah.
Follow-up question. Did FAA have any trends that were different from the federal government as a whole?
Sort of. So it wasn't something that I actually looked into all that much using this data. It's something that we looked into more with our own data. We have a lot of air traffic controllers to look into. And being able to see their trends in particular, what makes them happy. And obviously, they don't have things like telework. So being able to identify the usually lesser known employee benefits programs that make them happy and make sure that those are robust enough for them, that's really interesting. But with this open data, it's actually a lot easier to look at the department level with this particular dashboard. So when you actually go in here, I'm not even in here, it's DOT. Because we're technically part of Department of Transportation, which makes all the sense in the world. But you won't actually see, you also won't see CIA, IRS in here. It's an open data set. There's definitely some things that aren't included. But on our end, yeah, there's a lot of different insights, particularly around our traffic controllers. Anything else over there? Yes?
You showed tech or likeliness to leave or respond to that question. How did you measure actual data?
Yeah, so that FedScope, it's a quarterly report for the active workforce. And then there's an annual report with the separations. And all of these things have dates. The new hires have dates. So you can pretty easily extrapolate whatever separation rate that you need. So that's how I got that. Yeah. Yes?
Yeah, so on that question, what was the cutoff time for people leaving? So you answer the survey, they say they're going to most likely leave. What's your cutoff on, well, they didn't leave?
Oh, I see. So that's where that cohort analysis comes in, right? My cohort was a mix of, gender, department, age group, I think federal tenure, that type of stuff, right? And I made that as kind of my identifier for a particular group. And then I aggregated all of the data from FedScope and FedView onto that kind of new cohort. So it's actually an aggregated field as to when they actually ended up leaving, based on you are in a particular category here. Overall, your averages for leaving is 5 years or something. So that's where that came in. It's not a direct thing, because obviously I don't have a nice, convenient employee ID in both data sets. You kind of had to make one up. Yeah. So it's an estimate, but it's a pretty good one. Anything else? Yes?
What type of
No, this would only be federal employees. So it's all of the active federal employees, and then of course all of the employees that were newly hired within that past year and separated within that past year. So it's just for federal employees. Yeah. I would actually love if there were like better contracting databases, because it's a huge part of our workforce. Like, we need to take them into account. But I know. Yeah, it'd be really nice to take that into consideration. You had a question?
I just had a question regarding how you were using the outputs from this to drive change pursuits at the upper level within FAA, or is it still ongoing?
I mean, it's still ongoing, but there's still a number of sections that are applicable, like all that telework stuff, right? We're proving here, like that participation in benefits programs works. It's making higher engagement scores, and higher engagement scores is what every agency wants, right? So you want to be able to look at this and implement it. I actually have finished a number of more in-depth telework dashboards in particular. The typical anecdote that you hear is that when somebody teleworks, they're not working as hard as they should be, but we proved that wrong. We were able to take our actual performance ratings, judge them against the number of days you telework per pay period, and we saw that people were doing great. If anything, they were doing slightly better than people that were in the office for some departments. So being able to apply that type of result, that's where the real benefits are coming in. And I showed you a ton here. There's like an answer to almost anything if you find it. And if you have the ability to get the real data sources that you have and kind of implement the same type of, deep dive into it, I guess. Yes? So that's where Hyper and Maestro would be super great. The only reason I'm using R is because a number of the calculations that I was doing, like that Kaplan Meier curve, just took way too long and basically like broke Tableau. I crashed Tableau so many times making this thing. So especially when it came to actually creating that cohort, most of the cohort analysis was done in R and then just sent off into Tableau to be visualized. So a lot of the background math, frankly, was done in R, even though I wasn't too happy about having to use it that way. I was frankly expecting to use the R integration in Tableau to a greater extent, but I just couldn't. I tried, and it would break and give me half a calculation, and yeah, so it'd be great to be able to clean data better and do more of those bigger calculations in Tableau itself. Sorry, what was that? No, I use free things. I mean, this was a... Okay. Yeah, I mean, I just use like RStudio because it's what is available for grad students that aren't really getting paid for a side project with the GSA. I would love to use like Alteryx and like other stuff that, yeah, wishes for more funding. I'm trying to be efficient. They should give me more funding. Whatever. Other questions? Yes?
Yeah, so you mentioned on the Kaplan Meier curve, using it for performance ratings. How would you use it for that?
I mean, I'm not the expert here. That's the CDC. They're the ones who are actually looking into that functionality. I just want to like piggyback off of them next time we talk. But the idea was that you have performance ratings, right? So you're looking at a number of employees that just got their performance ratings. So let's look at them 6 months from now. What happened? Did our poor performance leave? Did they transfer into a different department or agency? Are our high performers leaving? Do they think they're better now so they can go somewhere cooler? I don't know. So it's definitely like you gotta have a good bit of data and some timeliness to it, but being able to apply something like that. And then the second part of that too was newly promoted folks. What was going on with them maybe a year from now? And see, are those the types of people? I know in the FAA, that one in particular I'm looking into, because we're finding that a lot of our new managers need a lot more manager training. But we're also finding that a lot of our new managers are younger. So this also ties into all of that succession planning that we're having issues with. Like, how can we implement that better? How can we prepare people a lot earlier? Because a lot of them are going to be going into these positions that maybe they're not prepared for. So if we can take that information and kind of give us at least a heads up for upcoming waves of this, then that would be extremely helpful. So, yeah, that's some math I really want to do. It's fun. Cool. What else? Anything? No? 10 minutes early? Cool. Well, thank you.